Hello and welcome to the Mobile Accessible Games interview series. I'm your host, Aaron Spelker. Mobile Accessible Games is a group that's focused on all things about mobile accessible gaming. And through our interview series, we meet with game developers as well as accessibility influencers. And this week we have Marty Schultz from Blindfold Games, one of the premier developers of games for the blind and visually impaired. So Marty, welcome to the interview series.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Aaron. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. So, Marty, I always like to just start off the interview series, just turning it over to you. Just tell people just a little bit about yourself. Who you are and what role you play in accessible gaming.
Sure. So I'm a serial software entrepreneur. I've started a number of software companies over my career, and I got interested in making accessible games really serendipitously. It kind of dates back to when my daughter, who was not visually impaired, was in middle school. And just before her birthday, about a month before her birthday, every day she would write out a new list of what she wanted to get for her birthday. And then the next day she would rip up that list and start a new list. And this went on day after day after day. And this was back in about 2012. And I thought, there should be an app for that where kids could basically come up with their own birthday wish list and then send it to their parents. So I thought it would be an interesting idea. And I thought I could either kind of build this app because I enjoy building apps. I could either build the app and then focus test it with some of her teeny bopper friends, or I could make it into a STEM learning opportunity where I would teach some of the kids at her school how an app is actually created. So I contacted the head of school and I said, I want to run an after-school club for about 6 weeks. I want to meet with the kids about 3 times a week for an hour, and the kids and I will design a birthday wish list app. And then I'll do the program in the evening. And then over the course of about 6 weeks, we'll have finished the app. And the head of school just absolutely loved the idea, but I had to get go through a background check first, fingerprinted and all that before I could do that. And then by this time it was almost November, but we finally got the club off the ground. The kids had a great time. We had about 30 kids in the club. And we ended up building up this kind of birthday wish list app. It was called Wish to List. And we ended up getting it out right before the winter holidays.
At the Christmas list and Easter list, all sorts of holidays.
Anything you wanted. That's right. And you could, and the kids came up with ideas of sharing their list with their friends and letting their friends vote on what kind of gifts they want, and concepts of being able to walk into a store and scan the barcode to add it to your list. All the things kids wanted to do, we put into the game, and I had a lot of fun building it and learning how to accomplish all those things on an app. So at the end, when the new semester started, the head of school comes back to me and she says, Marty, can you please run the app club again? Parents loved it and the kids loved it. So I said, fine. He said, also, after you drop off your daughter in the mornings, would you be willing to teach the middle schoolers how to program as an elective? So I thought, well, I want to support the school. So I said, fine. Relating to that, I actually did that for 2 years in teaching the middle schoolers how to program. And it wasn't until I finished the final semester that I realized why they had parent volunteers to teach the middle school students first period. Well, that was because that's how long it took these kids, these monsters, to calm down enough to be able to handle their core curriculum.
Or wake up.
That's right. But, it was quite a challenge. And I think I had about 6 kids that weren't really wanted to be there at all, about 6 kids who kind of knew it, but they could really care one way or the other, and then 6 really bright kids who really wanted to work on it. And to try to keep all 3 sets of kids, about 20 kids, moving forward without a degree and actually how to teach was quite a challenge for me. But we managed, and the kids had a good time when they learned. The interesting concept came when we actually ran the app club. And we only had about 6 or 7 kids come out for the app club the second time. But the kids said, we don't want to build some stupid app. We want to build a game. We said, well, what kind of game do you want to build? And they said, well, and they kept coming up with more and more games that were just clones of something else that was in the App Store. So I said, look, if I'm going to put my programming time into this, I don't want to build a clone of what somebody else has done. So why don't you go for 2 weeks, come back, and then tell me what ideas you have that are creative. 2 weeks later, they come back and they don't really have any creative ideas. And I happen to be holding an iPad in my hands, kind of turning it and twisting it. And I thought, what if we build something that doesn't need the screen? Because every app in the App Store uses the screen. And so, well, what do you mean? I'm moving the iPad almost like a steering wheel. I said, well, let's make a driving game for blind people. I had never met anyone who was blind before in my life. And the kid said, well, how would it work? I said, I don't know. I guess blind people probably get around by listening as opposed to, seeing things. So maybe if you drive too far to the left, the music will get louder in your left ear. If you turn the iPad as a steering wheel too far to the right, the music will get louder in your right ear. And then we'll design different types of tracks for you to drive on. And one of the kids says, well, why don't we have things for them to avoid and other things for them to hit? I said, okay, what do you mean? One girl said, well, you could avoid obstacles like barking dogs or mooing cows. I said, that's a good idea. And another kid said, well, you can aim for prizes that make noise like popping popcorn or opening up a can of soda. So over the course of the next 6 to 8 months, the kids and I built out a 60-level game that got more and more complex. It had mini games built within it that was all played entirely as an audio game. And I kept talking to my friends and they said, well, have you tested with anyone who's blind? I said, no, they'll probably just laugh us right out of the room because we just so missed the point. Well, we finally got up enough credence to test it with the Miami Lighthouse for the Blind. We staged about 10 iPads and brought headphones and had the teens play the game for 2 to 3 hours. And they seemed to absolutely love it. I think one of the teens there said, why don't you call the game Blindfold Racer, which we did. And he was the same teen that had said, is there anything on the screen when you're playing? I said, no. He said, well, you better put something on the screen because when sighted people play this game, if they don't see anything on the screen, they'll think their iPad is broken.
Yeah.
So we followed all their suggestions and then we put it into the App Store. And it suddenly, this is back in 2014 or so, it jumps to the top of all the accessible games. I think we got I think we won a prize that year from AppleVis. And I started hearing from people all over the world about me creating more audio games.
Well,
At the same time,
I imagine particularly at that time, 2012, I mean, there's not much on the market for the blind community too. So, I mean, I'm sure, there's a lot more accessible games now, but it must have been pretty revolutionary back in the 2012 to 14 timeframe to be finding a game and, not a word or puzzle game, but something that's a little bit more interactive. I imagine that was pretty novel that wasn't something like that.
It must have been because people actually love this game, and I really used anything I could to never depend on somebody's vision. I didn't even know there was a concept of voiceover there. So the first version we put out there, basically, I emulated my own voiceover for the setting screens. But in any case, I happened to be up in the Boston area where I started a number of companies, and I figured I'd stop in at Perkins School for Blind to show them, and they thought it was interesting. I think at that meeting, one person asked if I could make I think a blackjack game or something like that, because he had just gotten back from Vegas and played blackjack with the help of her sighted friend. And then a few weeks later, I had met with some other people who had contacted me. That I happened to run into Kim Charlson and Brian Charlson, both who Kim used to be the president of the American Council for the Blind, and Brian was the director of technology of the Carroll Center, and also very active in the Bay State Council for the Blind. Yeah. And also actually met them at their house, was Judy Dixon, who at that point was involved in the Talking Book program in the National Library of Congress. And they had actually been up all night playing Blindfold Racer so they could give me all sorts of advice on how to improve it and make other games. And at that meeting, I think Brian asked for a cryptogram game, Kim asked for a solitaire game, and I think Judy asked for a Sudoku game. So over the next few months, since I was semi-retired at the time, I came out with those games. And then I started hearing from more and more people. So I think every month I would get dozens of suggestions of different games. And by the time I had most of the games built out and was moving on to a different project, it had been like 4 years I'd been building them, popping out about a game a month. And I had sports games and TV game show games and card games, pretty much any type of popular video game. There was, when Candy Crush was all the rage, I did an equivalent thing called Color Crush. And I think it had about 100 different packs of add-ons you could put into Color Crush that might be, say, the names of all the stations in the London subway system, or the name or the types of kings and queens and every type of culture around. So I did so many of those, and the games just kept becoming more and more popular. By around 2016 or 17, I started hearing from a lot of TVIs, teachers of students with visual impairments, and orientation mobility specialists. And they told me that they were using some of the games, like a bowling game, to teach fine motor control and cause and effect. And at that point, one of the O&Ms, a woman by the name of Diane Browner, asked me to create, I think, a battleship game and a 3D tic-tac-toe game. And I said, why? She said, well, the battleship game can help kids learn grid concepts because everything, when you're moving your ships, you're moving them from like A1 to A2 to B2.
Right.
And that helps them really get the concept of the grid in their head at the same time as learning the game. And then with tic-tac-toe, she said, if you can build a 3D tic-tac-toe game, that takes that concept one step further. And blind kids tend to be much better at 3D tic-tac-toe than sighted kids. So this will be something they can play with their sighted friends. So I did those, and all the games were very popular. I think all the games in total, last time I looked about a year ago, had been downloaded about 500,000 times across all the games. I think the most popular game was Blindfold Racer, had been downloaded about 80,000 times. So we knew we were making a lot of people happy, but we kept getting a lot of pressure to say, can you use your skills at building games to make more educational games? So I started looking into that, going to a couple of conferences of TVIs and O&Ms and other people in the blindness field and providing either education or rehabilitation, and realized there was an opportunity that we could come out, build an educational company, games company, to look at a lot of the games that kids need as part of the expanded core curriculum and produce games like that that could be managed by teachers with progress reports showing the kids' progress that could be used as part of an IEP. And we went and raised some money for this new company, and we went out there and started building out the games and getting out in people's hands. Then COVID hit, and we realized nobody is going to test out these games in the middle of a pandemic. Sure. So we basically offered the games for free for any school to use in, I think, the spring semester of 2020. And we had hundreds and hundreds of teachers and school districts sign up and start using it. And then in the following fall, a lot of that kind of freebie was over, a lot of them came back and renewed their subscriptions and continue to use our product with their kids today. I think right now we have about 4 of the 10 largest school districts in the country using the company's called Objective Ed, and they're using Objective Ed's gamified curriculum. We have about a quarter of the schools for the blind using it. So all in all, it's been a very interesting journey. Now, in the process, we realized that we need additional help in building out these games. So we started applying for government grants. And after trying for about 2 or 3 years, we started winning some grants to build out more and more technology. I think we won a grant from Health and Human Services to build an interactive fiction story. In other words, a computer-based choose-your-own-adventure game where teens could learn the steps necessary to get a summer job. So we take them through this virtual journey, all as an audio game, in applying for a job, going on interviews, getting ready for the first day on the job, succeeding at the first day on the job, and then continuing afterwards. It takes about 5 or 6 hours to complete this story game. And from our initial testing of it, kids who are 16 to 18 years old really like playing it and practicing those skills. They'll either play the game to see how really good they can score or see how really bad they can score, just to see what happens when they do really dumb things.
Is that you said computer? Is that only on the computer, or is that on the iPhone as well?
It's on the I think the version's available. I think it's either browser based or iPad, iPhone based. I forget, but
what's the name of that?
That's part of the Objective Ed series, and that's called Transition Adventure.
It reminds me, there's a Canadian, I think same thing. They won a grant to build out a game for blind people to learn how to be entrepreneurs called what is it, Global Zone Entrepreneur or something like that. It's called. So the same sort of concept. And how did you know, like, to go out and look for grants, or the original? You said you started raising some money for the new company around education. Where do you go to find that? I mean, is that friends and family raising money, or is that
for raising money? It was basically people who I had made money for before in some of my other software ventures. As far as the grant, I would go to these meetings of AER, the Association for Educational Rehabilitation of Blind and Visually Impaired People. There's a lot of regional conferences, like in Massachusetts has one, New Hampshire has one, Virginia has one. And I would go and talk about what we had there, present a paper, and explain what we're all doing. And then people would tell me, by the way, you should look at the government, and they might be able to help you offset some of your costs. So I looked into what's called a small business innovation research grant and found about 5 or 6 different agencies in the government: the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, Health and Human Services, along, of course, with the Department of Defense, provides these grants where you win some money to first build a prototype and then build a full-fledged system. I think the very first grant we ever won was out of Microsoft. So I had won a prize from given out by the National Braille Press called the Touch of Genius Award for an innovation we did back in about 2019 or so. And what we did there was we took a sheet of Braille, we put it on the iPad, and then with the iPad knowing kind of what's on that sheet of Braille, we were able to build games to help kids with early Braille literacy. So, for example, a teacher could write a story if she knows the child she's working with really likes horses. So she could write a one-page Braille sheet story about the day in the life of a horse. And then she'd type this story into the computer. It would download everything onto the iPad. She'd put a sheet of Braille on top of that, which is the story as well. The child would read through the story, and then the game would start, and the game would say, okay, where does the horse sleep at night? And then the child would have to kind of scan through all the words, and when she got to the word barn in its contracted form, she would double tap the screen.
Nice.
And that way she could basically practice contractions. She could practice learning word beginnings and endings and all basic Braille and even dot recognition, all through this iPad game that uses a sheet of Braille on the iPad. Well, we won the award, the Touch of Genius Award, that year, and then they said come out to the CSUN conference, which I did, and that's where they kind of gave me the award. And at that meeting, I wanted to get together with a fellow by the name of Kirk Adams, who was the CEO of the American Foundation for the Blind. He happened to be there, and I said, let's get together for drinks at CSUN. Well, he was just finishing up a meeting with somebody from Microsoft in the Microsoft Artificial Intelligence for Accessibility, their AI for Accessibility group. And she asks, how come we've never tried to get a Microsoft grant to build some of our stuff? And I said, well, I don't really know what we would use AI for to help people who are visually impaired. And Kirk and I think it was Jennifer and I were talking for a while. And he asked, Kirk, when you were in grade school and middle school, how did you learn how to read Braille on a Braille display? He said, well, I would read it, and then I would have somebody sitting next to me, and she would verify that what I read was correct. I said, well, using speech recognition, we could actually do the same thing with a refreshable Braille display. So I asked the person at Microsoft, would something like that be applicable for a grant? And she said, give it a try. So we started figuring out how this would all work. And then we applied for the grant, and we won a Microsoft AI for Accessibility grant to build out what then became the Braille AI tutor.
So how far on those grants, like how far do you have to be along? I mean, do you have to show them a prototype, or do you just say, I have an idea?
With Braille AI tutor, it was just the idea. We told them we had completed the first product, which was the sheet of Braille paper on the iPad, which we called Braille Sheets. Right. But the Microsoft grant, we simply said, what we want to do is build something where you send us a sentence to the Braille display, the kid will read the sentence out loud, and if they read it correctly, they'll move ahead in a treasure hunting game. And that was it. That's all we said. I mean, it was about barely 4 pages long. You had to combine with letters of recommendation and why it was important, things like that. But pretty much that was it. And we won it, and we ended up building that, which was great because at that point,
did they also check your coding pedigree, like the fact that you had Blindfold Games as
I mentioned all that, but I think it was the testimonial letters that said, yes, this guy's been providing solutions for visually impaired people for the past 6 years. They've won a number of prizes. What they're building seems to make sense, and that was good enough for Microsoft. I think Microsoft's major goal in that was probably to show that AI could be used for good and to get some publicity out of it. The publicity helped them, the publicity helped us. We actually used that as a stepping stone, that when we started applying for some of the government grants, we had shown that we were already a good steward of grant money, and we deliver the project on time and on budget. So when we started competing for these government grants, or at least it wasn't the first time out of doing something and getting a grant and building from scratch. So we won, since then, we've won about 4 different government grants, some for doing things for people with vision impairments. And the 2 latest grants we've won is to do that same concept of a summer job story, like we did for blind and low vision teens. We're doing the same thing for students on the autism spectrum. And then we won another grant from the National Science Foundation to actually take the ideas we experimented with in the Braille AI tutor and use it to actually help students who either low vision or have dyslexia improve their reading skills. Now, in the same way that Braille AI tutor has the child read a sentence and then we verify if they read it correctly using speech recognition, what this new product called Buddy Books does is the computer and the child alternate reading from a book that they can get out of Bookshare. So maybe a Harry Potter book or something like that. The computer will read one sentence, and the child, using either very large font on the screen if the child is low vision, or regular font and the child has dyslexia, the child will read a sentence. It goes back and forth and back and forth. Meanwhile, we're using that same analysis to see if they said everything correctly and show that to their teacher, so that way the next time the teacher meets with the student, they can focus on the areas where the child had the most problems.
But you said, so can you do that with any book on Bookshare, or are there certain Bookshare books that this is compatible with?
Every book on Bookshare.
Oh, that's it. I have a book on Bookshare, so go try with that.
Yeah. And so we actually built that starting in January, and we were kind of had a proof of concept towards the summer. We were notified by the NSF that we'd probably get the grant in around that same time, but we continued building it so that now that the NSF has actually awarded us the grant about a month or 2 ago, we kind of moved ahead some of the goals. And one of the goals of the upcoming version of Buddy Books will also include working with a Braille display. So we'll be experimenting with that. And on our research team, we have some university scientists that are very familiar with literacy for blind and low vision students, others that are really understand the concept of reading, others that understand dyslexia, and others that understand speech and language impairments.
So this is going to be a 2-part question. So first, you're involved in a lot of different things, a lot of different types of concepts. I imagine there's a team behind that. So if you could tell me kind of who makes up the team, how many people are on the team, and then the second part of that question, with these grants, I mean, is a grant enough to support the team to run for a year, to run through a concept, or is it just kind of defray some costs and you still have to, like how much does a grant really support you to be able to do what you're doing?
Right. So the team, we're about 6 or so engineers in the company. At this point, I'm primarily doing sales and marketing, and we have one person who used to be a special ed teacher who does a lot of the customer reach out and customer success, but the rest is all software development or product management and QA. So it's a very small company, as opposed to Blindfold Games, which was just me doing the programming. I did all the programming Blindfold Games. I didn't have anyone else, because basically it didn't make any money. This low amount of money we'd actually charge for each game, being like $1 to $3 or something like that, was barely enough to pay the costs of the annual Apple fees and all the other related software that we needed. And I think for the 4 or 5 years that it was generating most of its money, it was basically covering my health insurance. So but getting back to the second question with the grants, usually a grant will run anywhere from 6 to 12 months in the phase 1 of a grant, where you're basically proving out its viability. And then if you've proven it out and tested it with kids, you can go for a phase 2 where you get a lot more. And then that would cover you for about 2 years of those same engineers working on it. But in the phase 1, you're usually covered between 6 and 8 months of the team.
And actually, going back to, you're doing a lot of things here with the education, and as you said, you did coding all the games of the Blindfold Games, and there's such a variety of things that you're doing. you know what, I feel like a lot of developers, you know, they get a niche and they kind of stick with that niche for the most part, or maybe some variety on that niche. But I mean, you're creating, you know, when you were doing the games in particular, you were doing board games, card games, you know, 3D racer games, knockoffs of or variations of, you know, popular games that are out there like Flappy Bird and, you know, Color Crush and stuff like that. I mean, how did you know how to do all that different coding? Because I imagine it's, you know, coding one type of game is different than coding another type of game, and coding for a braille display is different than, you know, coding for some of the other things that you're doing. Like, how do you have that knowledge, or is it just, you know, over the, you know, I guess maybe the team now that you have a six, maybe different people have different expertise, but, you know, back when you were just you, how did you know how to do all of that?
Basically, building a game is not too hard. It's like building any piece of software. And the advantage of building a game when you're working with people who don't primarily use their vision is that you don't have to worry about any screen, any graphics at all, which vastly simplifies the problem. Now, it does mean that the game from the ground up has to feel accessible, and all these games have been built for accessibility. It's not a clone on at the end to add accessibility. A lot of games that are accessible that are in the App Store, you have to, you know, use voiceover and be swiping left and right to get to the right button and things like that, which really slows down gameplay. All these games from the beginning were designed to be played as audio games, so you have to come up with enough gestures to make them work. But once you understand what the goal of the game is, building out an actual game where you're playing against a computer is not all that hard. You have to figure out what the game mechanics are. But bowling, where you're flicking your fingers on the screen, has different mechanics than a card game where you're simply moving cards from pile to pile. But it's all little programming projects. None really took more than a month. And then we're tested for about 3 months with a set of 50 different low vision and blind testers that helped me out over the years. The hardest thing was, if it was a strategy game, coming up with the right strategy that your computer opponent could take. I think the hardest one we found around there was building out Monopoly, where it's really hard to find strategies that work to make you successful Monopoly. And I ended up solving that one by finding in French somebody's master's thesis from the mid-90s that I used Google Translate to translate into English to figure out 6 different very effective Monopoly strategies. And then I simply program them into the game and let you pick which strategy you want to play against with one or more opponents.
So the Blindfold Games part of the business, is that really just kind of, you know, the games that you've created are out there and, you know, you're basically maintaining them and you're completely on to the educational part of the business and that's what you're focusing on, or are you kind of running both in some sort of tandem?
No, I don't. I mean, doing either is more than a full-time job. So when I was in Blindfold Games, it was at least 40 hours a week, because you'd be building a game and you'd be adding improvements to all the other games. Objective Ed is likewise all-consuming, because at the same time we're looking at what this next government grant's going to be, making sure we're building a product that school systems will actually pay money for, making sure that the company is well positioned so we can raise our next round of funding. So there's attending slews of regional or national conferences, producing product literature that we can send out to the schools and to explain to parents, and running webinars. So it's a lot of work.
Yeah. And
this week alone, over the next 6 weeks, I'll be traveling probably once a week to a different show, a different conference on dyslexia, as part of the NSF project for Buddy Books, to talk about what we have and kind of get feedback from teachers, at the same time as going to a couple of vision conferences in Georgia and Florida, where I'll be talking about how Buddy Books can help a lot of kids with low vision and what we're planning on doing for braille displays. So
even things like that, even with all these conferences and things, how do you become aware of those? Are you hearing it through the grapevine? Is there a list of, here's all the vision conferences for the year 2022, and then you reach out to those people?
With vision impairment's really easy, because I've been doing this so long and our names spread out. So when somebody's running a conference, they'll usually send us an email because they want us to purchase an exhibitor table for like $250 or something like that. And if it's nearby where one of us lives and we can get there affordably, then we'll go. For dyslexia or for autism, it's really everything's from the ground up, which is the same way we start in the visual impairment world, which is we do a Google search for what conferences are going on, and then we start talking to the people who run those conferences and saying, oh, where else should we go? Or we look at other companies that are showing at the conference, and then we jump on their website and we look at all the web conferences that they're attending. So you just kind of learn by doing. There's no, once you're an established name, they contact you, but until then, it's just going through hundreds of Google pages.
Right. So with all of these, whether it be the educational or back when you were doing the Blindfold Games, I mean, how did you define success for yourself when you put out one of the games? What made it successful in your eyes, or when you're putting out one of these educational tools?
Well, those are two different concepts. For Blindfold Games, it was successful if people sent me emails saying they liked it. Okay, I was not looking for economic success. You don't go into building games in the visual impairment world expecting economic success, because it won't happen, because given that 70% of the people out there are on fixed income, you can't rip them off. I mean, there was the amount of money we charge for the game is so little, it basically, the justification was, look, we have certain fixed costs. If somebody wants to pay $1 to $3 for something they're going to spend a lot of time on, it's no different than them getting, an iTunes subscription or Netflix every month or things like that. So it's not an unreasonable pricing. But to make a lot of money, basically even to offset the cost of the engineering that goes into that, if I actually build my time out as a programmer, they can never make money. With Objective Ed, it's different, because it's a for-profit company. So we have to prove to our investors and to the community, to the school districts, that we're building things that have enough value that they will spend their money on and buy something we're creating in lieu of spending that same money on something else. So we define success by, are we selling this product to school districts? And once we sell it to them, are they using it with their kids? And once they start using it with their kids, are the kids making the improvements that the researchers told us they should, based on the games we built?
Do those tend to be, does a school district buy buddy books as a one-time purchase, or is it something that is, subscription based, or has updates that, here's the latest update, that's an additional $2 or whatever?
Yeah, they're all sold on a per student per year basis, because we have fixed costs in there for that are related to the number of people using it. For example, we have to use the Microsoft speech recognition system, which costs us money. So every time, for every minute that we're translating what the student has said into the corresponding words and the corresponding phonemes, we pay Microsoft a fee. So it's a kind of a variable cost model that we pass on to the schools, plus money on top of that, so we can keep investing into the product. And we see there's a large future for buddy books as we expand out into maybe helping kids, immigrant kids who are learning English language learners, and helping them read by accessing books and doing this buddy reading back and forth, or doing the same thing for kids who are learning Spanish in this country and other countries. So there's a lot of different directions to take this.
And does the current company, does it focus all around education, around people who struggle with some sort of disability, or do you expand beyond that?
Right now, we're only focusing on people with disabilities, because the educational system is much more designed for individual learning for anyone who has an IEP than for general ed, where kind of everybody is shoveled the same content at the same time. But in special education, working with kids with disabilities, then there's much more of an individualized approach, which means we can build things that the teacher can fine tune for each child.
So do you have to, go school district by school district, or do you go to conferences where school district, superintendents come to, and that's how, you get inroads to?
We both contact school districts for, like Buddy Books, we contact school districts who know us because of the products we did for blind and low vision kids over the past 3 years. So kind of it's word of mouth spreading within that school district, as well as going to conferences and meeting usually either teachers who are helping students with that given disability, or that's where the special ed director goes, or that's where the assistive technology director goes, and looking for more solutions to bring back to the school.
So
for example, at the end of January, there's something called the Assistive Technology, ATIA, Assistive Technology something association. And they do like a 3-day show in Orlando. And we went there about 3 years ago, just before COVID, and then we'll go back again this year.
I was going to say, is summertime a really busy time for all these conferences when teachers and administrators are out of the school?
Usually not, because a lot of teachers, as part of their union contract, do not have to work in the summer.
The summer,
only people in the school districts working are usually administration. So sometimes you will find organizations for that disability, focusing on adults, things like the National Foundation for the Blind or the American Council of the Blind. They'll have their conference in the summer because there are very few conferences in the summer, and they can get much better rates at the hotel. But the major conferences are either in the fall or the spring for the teachers and for the special ed directors.
So which educational program is taking up all your time right now? Is there something new that's coming out, or?
Well, we're still in the process of launching buddy books. So that's where a lot of my time is being spent. And we have about 4 or 5 more grants that we submitted to the government that we'll hear about in January that relate to doing teaching more job skills for kids who are visually impaired, teaching college readiness skills for both kids who are visually impaired and kids on the autism spectrum. NIH gave us funding to prototype out some iPad-based games to teach early math concepts like shape recognition, line recognition for kids in pre-K to 1st grade. And then we have a follow-up for that grant that we submitted to actually basically do about 10 different skills for the youngest kids. And then another grants application to NIH to teach graphing skills so that when kids are in middle school, they can learn Desmos and really master that the same way sighted kids master that. Desmos is the graphing package that is used on most of the standardized tests to get to college.
When you think back of your Blindfold Games development days, what was your favorite game that you created? Like, which one is your personal
favorite game? Well, Blindfold Racer was always a lot of fun, but it was probably the hardest because it had so many mini games in it. What else was a lot of fun? Color Crush was a lot of fun because it was fun to add more and more packs to it. And then anytime I did a sports game, that was fun because I would try to somehow align gestures with the phone with the movements that game might require to give it a more realistic feeling.
Sure. Now, with all that hard work that you've done, did your daughter go into computer programming?
Not at all.
Not at all.
She didn't even attend the second.
Didn't support that, huh?
Not at all.
I imagine that's what, 10 years ago, so she's probably off, in college or out of college at this point, starting her career.
She's kind of in college and pursuing jobs in the music industry.
Oh, very good. Very, very good. Well, Marty, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Thanks for, a decade ago starting Blindfold Games. I think a lot of the people in the blind and visually impaired community have enjoyed those games over the years. I really like the focus that you're doing now of adding education and gaming, to help, kids with their development. So a really noble cause, and I hope you win all the grants that you have out there. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. And by the way, we usually only win about a quarter of the grants we go after, but it's just you got to keep failing until you succeed.
It's a law of numbers, right? A game of numbers at that point.
Exactly.
Well, very good. Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, and we look forward to all the new things, and hopefully, we'll see that all the school districts utilizing different software from your company.
Well, thanks again for the opportunity to talk with you and your listeners.
Appreciate it.